This is Let Me Sum Up, your occasional deep dive into classic reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Mendel, recording once again from an undisclosed location, and as always, I'm joined by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Flower Power and Tie-Dyed T-shirts at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
I love that for me. Well, at least, let's face it, at least half my non-work wardrobe is tie-dye, so thank you for sharing that with our audience. And joining you from Gadigal country, I am not, however, wearing tie-dye this evening. Sorry to disappoint.
On audio, anything could be happening.
Well, that's true. Could be lying through my teeth.
We'll leave that to our listeners' theatre of the mind. I'm also joined by a man with both the style and the substance to hold his own in a 1960s Oval Office briefing, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Ooh, I guess my glasses frames are pretty thick.
I was more reflecting on your paisley tie and how that would not have been out of place in LBG's White House.
Yes. But late LBJ. 1965, I think things were still a little conservative.
Well, as you might have caught on this week's show, we're doing something different. Eschewing the usual format and digging into the back catalogue of classic climate reports. This is something we're thinking of doing from time to time to get a bit of perspective on the long arc of research and analysis in climate and energy that exists going back many, many years, as we'll confirm with today's discussion. It's an opportunity, Frankie, to, I guess, unpack some of the seminal papers that have got us to where we are today, along with our usual fare, which is the latest and greatest.
Absolutely. We haven't come up with a name for, LMSU classic series, if this is the classic FM channel.
Ooh. Gold LMSU.
Yeah, that's it. Rolled gold. But we've often reflected on, even in more recent papers, for example, the winner of our Wonky last year, how influential particular papers can be in terms of an inflection point and the thinking on things, and the one on learning rates that we often refer back to is just relevant in so many of the discussions we find ourselves in. And of course, that's true looking back through the decades, over the history of, the development of the science of climate change. So we thought it would be really fun to jump in the DeLorean and have a look at what some of the, the earlier offerings in terms of those either inflection points or really, influential moments where it might be, an influential government of the day in a particular country that commissioned work, or, preeminent scientists publishing, really landmark papers that have gone on to shape thinking for long afterwards. So I was really excited to read this paper because I don't often have cause to go digging through, the sort of archives of the White House or wherever this one was earthed up.
There is a lot to be learned from going through the past, including the areas where we've advanced and the areas where we haven't actually advanced that much at all. And the debates and the perspectives are comfortingly or worryingly familiar. And so I thought that this paper, what we are about to dissect, was an excellent candidate for our first journey into the timey-wimey old paper seeker outatron.
I understand that you've got some kind of Foley work you need to do to indicate our journey into the past.
I think we're missing this is very much the sort of Mad Men era. We need to be like swilling a whiskey glass around just to give an appropriate atmospheric.
That's true. But you also need to apply an echo effect and have one of us say, "Time warp! Time warp!" as we go back through the decades to 1965.
Okay, we're going to chat about a report. Cue music.
We don't need music. Tennant just gave us all the sound effects we could hope for and more.
1965, the US President Lyndon Baines Johnson received a report titled Restoring the Quality of Our Environment from the President's Science Advisory Council. The report provided President Johnson with a clear-eyed analysis of a number of the key environmental challenges facing the US, from air pollution to water quality to the impacts of pollutants on plants and animals. But it is Appendix Y4, atmospheric carbon dioxide, that marks this as a seminal document in the history of climate science and analysis. This appendix was penned at a critical moment, shortly after the first 5 years of granular, high-quality data on the concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere had been collected. The authors use this data as the jumping-off point for laying out what they describe as a vast geophysical experiment: the role of fossil fuels in increasing CO2 levels, why higher levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are likely to drive increasing temperatures, and some early descriptions of the potential implications for Earth's physical systems. Tennant, you put this report on our radar. Why were you excited for us to read it?
So I first came across this report years ago when I had been having a chat with somebody who insisted to me that climate change, quote unquote, was a term that was made up in the 80s or the 90s when environmentalists realised they couldn't keep talking about global warming because there was a pause in global warming. And obviously I was talking to a rolled gold idiot, but the question of when did the term climate change start to become used inspired me to have a little look, and via the excellent website skepticalscience.com, I found that there was a major public policy use of essentially the same term, climatic change, in this report to the Johnson administration in 1965. And when I read it, and then had another read of it, like it really is a sign of just how consistent the key physics arguments, geophysics, ocean and atmospheric physics, arguments and knowledge has been for a long time. Yes, there have been important advances. There's areas where there was much greater uncertainty and now there's much less. There are some things that scientists thought that haven't panned out, and others that have only proved to be more prescient. But the basics have been known for a long time. So that makes a lot of what came later, both some people who ought to have known better and possibly did, saying, "Oh, it's all tremendously uncertain," or "It's not happening," makes it even more annoying than it already was.
Yeah, it's really Exhibit A in the case for the fact that the science of climate change has been building inexorably over a century. This is not something that was dreamt up in the mid-80s as a plot to dismantle global capitalism or something. Yeah. The authors point to the insight that two separate scientists had around the start of the 20th century that increasing CO2 levels could have an impact on climate. They point to the careful work that took place in the physical sciences over, whatever it was, 5-6 decades that firmed up the theory around this insight. And the report comes at a really critical moment, right? Because they're building on really important work that had been done collecting data between, I think it was 1958 and 1963, collecting the data that was able to characterise the way that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was increasing and correlating that with changes in the Earth's climate. So there's been a long march of scientific progress over more than a century, but this report in 1965 is the first that I'm aware of that brings that narrative together.
Yes.
And breaks out of the realm of physical scientists largely talking amongst themselves, and importantly advises government on how there are far-reaching implications of this for the Earth's physical systems, as well as the potential for big long-run impacts on human beings. And that's why it marks an inflection point. This was the moment when climate change, or the prospect of it, went from peer-reviewed journals to a challenge that was on the agenda of governments.
Like, to a point, right?
Yes.
Like, I would put a big fat asterisk next to some of that, and I agree with like everything you've said. In that it's a really methodical step through of the best understanding of the science of the time. Like, there are some clanger lines in there, which I think, many of us who, before reading this paper, I was probably one of those people that was broadly aware that the science of climate change had been pretty well, if not settled, that there had been a very long-run consensus over the cause of climate change and global warming for some time. But I wouldn't have suggested it went as far back as the mid-60s, because the prevailing narrative is that it really kind of emerged in the political debate a bit later than that. And this report was very much commissioned by LBJ to talk about pollution in the very broad sense of that, right?
Yep.
So CO2 is sort of one appendix of many that talks about a whole bunch of different stuff,
yes.
Pesticides and different kinds of air pollution and, all sorts of things. I was sort of saying there are some clanger lines in here that say, there's we are without doubt that the combustion of fossil fuels is the major contributing factor to the increase in CO2 emissions, and step through all that. And then I think very methodically step through the possible effects of increased CO2 on the climate. So in terms of some of the physical impacts, talking about, melting of the Antarctic ice cap and rise in sea levels. I think to your earlier point, Luke, it provides a bit of a pre-rebuttal over whether anything else could have been causing this, and they talk through the possible options there and basically dismiss that at the end. But in terms of the conclusions, it doesn't really go very far towards saying how you might mitigate those impacts over time.
It's very weird.
It's so, in a 2023 context, it's so weird. They're sort of saying it's definitely the combustion of fossil fuels contributing to this CO2. We've looked at all the other options. We don't think anything else could feasibly be causing this.
Yeah.
We should look at doing, something about understanding that better. But there is zero suggestion in this paper that we should maybe not be burning fossil fuels anymore or doing anything to mitigate it.
So I'm really interested in this because I think I'm in a different space to both of you on this. Can you explain to me why you think it's weird in 1965 that these folk didn't leap to a sophisticated sort of analysis of, how one could, through policy instruments, mitigate global warming?
All right. So I've got some reasons for this, but I do want to really underline how far-sighted and terrific parts of this climate section are. I think most of our comments are going to be about the climate appendix.
Yes.
There's a little bit of climate content in the main report, just sort of giving a very short précis of the climate chapter. But the main report has got quite a lot of actionable recommendations. And yes, a lot of them are about how important it is, given that this is a report largely penned by university professors, how important it is to fund more research and get more people interested in being grad students.
Funny that.
Some things are a perennial, Tennant.
Yes, that's right. But, there are actionable recommendations about things like exploring effluent fees or taxes on a whole range of pollutants. They don't talk about CO2 in that context. They talk about policies to address the growth of motorcar pollution and various aspects of that. They talk about a lot of things about investments in changing over the nation's sewer systems because so many of them were just venting, commingling storm water and raw sewage. Anyway, there's a lot in there in the rest of it. And this chapter, I think this passage is worth reading because it just gets most of the story. Through his worldwide industrial civilization, man, this is a very 1965 passage, man is unwittingly conducting a vast geophysical experiment. Within a few generations, he is burning the fossil fuels that slowly accumulated in the earth over the past 500 million years. The CO2 produced by this combustion is being injected into the atmosphere. About half of it remains there. The estimated recoverable reserves of fossil fuels are sufficient to produce nearly a 200% increase in the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere. By the year 2000, the increase in atmospheric CO2 will be close to 25%. It wound up being actually just slightly higher than that, but that's pretty good. As an estimate, pretty bad as an outcome. This may be sufficient to produce measurable and perhaps marked changes in climate. The climatic changes that may be produced by the increased CO2 content could be deleterious from the point of view of human beings, which is a reasonably important point of view. They say all that, and it's great, and then what are their recommendations here? The recommendations don't even make it into the main report, except as a mention of examples of recommendations they didn't have room for in the main report.
And they're pretty wacko.
Well, one of them is just more research is needed. Let's have some grad students, please.
Well, yes, but can we talk about changing the albedo or reflectivity of the Earth for a second?
The other one is we need to investigate what today we would call geoengineering. We need to investigate means of compensating for the changes in Earth's climate caused by CO2. They have not a single word about slowing or reducing or avoiding the growth of CO2 in this section. Yeah. And it's bizarre because it's not like the people involved were unaware of that concept.
Well, yeah, so I guess you already sort of made that point in talking about the other content of this paper. I skimmed the beginning sections of it where they talk about other forms of pollution that there, I think, maybe has been a longer familiarity with in terms of the public discourse around some of those things. And they do talk about measures that you would take to mitigate that pollution, like from the source by changing behaviour or, as you said, kind of like taxing it. So it was kind of weird that these guys, rather than thinking about it in a similar frame like that, like it was just, maybe it's not weird that, you know, in the 60s that it just didn't occur to them that the foundation of the economy being, you know, industrialization and burning of fossil fuels could change.
All right. You've hit one of the reasons why I don't think it's weird. They're very careful to say that the increasing rates of carbon dioxide resulting from burning fossil fuels is an unwitting result of industrialisation. Fossil fuels underpin the entirety of the global economy at this point, certainly in the Western world. The idea that this was entirely out of their thought technology, that could be shifted, that machine could be changed, I don't find particularly surprising. It's worth noting this is very early work. This is the first attempt by scientists to communicate this to government, which brings me to my second point. They're pretty confident, but they're very careful to say that they're waiting on some important further work to understand exactly how CO2 is going to impact on climate over the long term. And they note a particular report that is forthcoming from the US Weather Bureau, which they say is developing a more sophisticated model, which includes the processes of convection and latent heat transfer through the evaporation and condensation of water vapour. They're acknowledging that these processes are really complex. And without that further work, policy recommendations to do anything, I think you could argue, would be premature. The third reason, which I think is the killer, is these are physical scientists that are writing this report. These are not policy professionals. They're not people that have their hands on the levers of government and thinking about how to affect change. This report is very much focused on explaining the physical science of climate change to a lay audience. And so I find it entirely unsurprising that the only idea that they have for mitigating climate change is overlaying another sort of physical impact on the top of everything else in geoengineering, because they're treating the economy as, what's the word, exogenous in the system.
Yeah.
Turnabout is fair play to economists.
Right? It's just something that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
But maybe there's something else that we can lay over in terms of, spewing particles into the atmosphere to counteract this new factor that is affecting the climate. So when you take into account, how fundamental fossil fuels were and the lack of, viable alternatives in 1965, when you take into account how nascent the quantitative science around this was in 1965 and how it would have been a really big deal to propose anything more substantive, and when you take into account just the mindset of the people writing this report, I find it entirely unsurprising that it didn't go further. In fact, I was surprised it went as far as it did in terms of confidence and clarity of messaging. And when I said earlier that it put it on the agenda of government, I didn't say it told government what to do or there was any particular program. It was just that this was the point where it had been tabled. Yes. The topic had been tabled with government, and that was an important inflection point, because after that, nobody can say we didn't know.
Yeah. This is an issue you need to keep an eye on.
Yep.
And yes, it's an appendix, and there are other things that no doubt were exercising the minds of the departments, which President Johnson says he was referring this report to. And I think that you see in the formation of the EPA by the Nixon administration within a few years some of those other issues in terms of pollution, much more present issues for the public, getting much higher billing in terms of both the legislation that formed the EPA and the kind of some of the early regulation that occurred. Again, it's unsurprising, but it's almost like the other thing that I would say is there is a sense in which this is the problem with climate change was a problem with the beginning because it's intangible.
Yes.
Right? It's not present in people's lives. Yeah. Even though the physical science firmed up and the confidence firmed up, it never really sort of lost that sense that it was something amorphous, something off in the future, something that might be happening, something that we're uncertain about. And so that it was interesting from that perspective as well.
It's worth saying a word about the people who did the writing. So the overall report is from the President's Science Advisory Council, which is a bunch of
men.
Oh yeah.
By the way,
entirely
so
men.
I have to jump in at this point. When I read, I think it was part of the introduction to the paper. Like the president's note up front. These men have been very busy working away on this, and I was like, was there no woman involved in the production of this report at all? I'm like, well, that would be very 1960s, wouldn't it? So I went trolling through the names of all the authors, and because sometimes they use initials with first names, it was hard to tell. But I did find definitely a woman's name in the list, like one of the, 40 or 50 names that are listed there. But I can't let this conversation go without remarking on the lack of gender diversity in the people who are doing this work as well. It sticks out like a sore thumb to a reader in 2023. And that just made me really sad thinking about potentially all the great women who weren't given the opportunity to reach that, that level of status in a career that, would have required university education and all the right connections and that sort of thing. We know the politics around this sort of stuff. So I can't let that go unremarked. It got my goat.
There's not a lot of diversity of any kind in
No.
this group of authors, unless like Ivy League and Pacific 10 university professors counts as diversity. But you've got, on the climate subcommittee, you've got Richard Revell, a pioneering climate scientist and oceanographer, Charles Keeling of the Keeling curve of measuring carbon dioxide from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, which was something that started in 1958 in the International Geophysical Year. That was a thing to get that going, and that's really where a lot of this started. Wally Broker, a geochemist, the guy who seems later to have coined the phrase global warming in the 70s, and a big-time geoengineering proponent, which shows the dangers of any report written by a committee where one guy is very enthusiastic about something. There's a lot of happenstance there. Harmon Craig, another geochemist and pioneer of radiocarbon studies of the carbon cycle, and Joseph Smagorinsky, who later pioneered computer modelling of climate change. So, they're scientists, they're men, they're very good at some stuff, but their collective output reminded me of going back to our Christmas holidays episode of the scenes in Don't Look Up, where the scientist gets the chance to talk to policymakers and he is unintelligible because he is so focused on, and this is what we know and this is how we know it, and there is no so what. There is no cut through on why you need to act. So, scientists are great, and sometimes they need some help. They didn't have it this time.
Notwithstanding your comments, Luke, as well, around the fact that this, of course, it was a very early piece of work, and we know the science and the complexity of the different impacts of climate change on different parts of the climate system were not as well understood as they are now. They do step out the potential rates of melting of the Antarctic ice cap. Yep. To any scientist with an understanding of that, I think even in the late 60s, that ought to have terrified a few people. And I would have thought that particular group of eminent scientists would more than understand the potential implications of an accelerated melting of that ice cap. They talk about how much the sea level could rise by 400 feet if that ice cap melted, and talked even about the potential rates of that happening quickly or not. So, I agree with most of what you said before, Luke, but then there were also some signs where actually if you sort of sat on that for a bit and thought about what the potential implications of even just that very obvious impact might have, that would be extraordinary in terms of an impact on humans.
All right. I did a little thought experiment and wondered how Tennant's paisley tie would have gone down in LBJ's Oval Office earlier. So you two roll in, your Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence rolling into LBJ's Oval Office. 1965.
Oh, I love that for me.
Let's hope that LBJ is not sitting on the toilet.
Indeed. What do you say to get him across the line, and what do you recommend? What do you actually want him to do? Based on the knowledge that you have and the confidence you have in 1965, based on what's in this appendix.
Yeah, well, the things that they said in the paper were true enough about needing to firm up the understanding of what it all means. But I think, notwithstanding the fact that these guys are scientists and not necessarily tasked with thinking about policy, implications of behaviour change and all that sort of thing, I'd be trying to stick a bigger kind of flag in the sand around the potential impacts of this, even based on like the science as it is today, could have significant implications for the livability of this planet in the next 50 to 100 years. I would be trying to underline the potential seriousness of the long-running impact of this. It's the frog that boils slowly in the water kind of analogy. And I think also, it should have even been reasonable. The global economy was premised on the use of fossil fuels, but it wouldn't have been the wrong thing to point out to say, well, if this continues unabated, there might be things that you could try and look at counterbalancing, a la geoengineering reflectivity particles scattered across the oceans stuff. Or we may need to seriously rethink how we produce and consume energy.
Yep. And
consume being the other piece of it, which I'm surprised you haven't remarked on yet, Luke, Mr. Energy Efficiency.
I'm on holiday, Frankie. I think I mentioned that.
With all the benefit of hindsight and talking about this 60-something years after they wrote it, that's probably what I would have said.
I think that's a good pitch. I think what I would have tried is to say, Mr. President, you're a space nut.
Yep.
The boys down at NASA are developing all kinds of stuff around solar energy for use in space. And they're developing nuclear energy for use in space. This is the height of nuclear power optimism. I think I would be saying you need a crash effort on R&D and exploration and demonstration around non-fossil sources of energy. There's recommendations in the main body of the paper about exploring fuel cells and battery electric for automobiles. And here's another great big fat reason to go hard on that. And there's time for the science to firm up, but we can keep busy in the meantime on things that will be a good idea. 10 years later, or a little more than 10 years later, during the oil shocks, the Carter administration wound up doing a crash policy effort on responding to that. And that was like its own odd mix of things that seemed far-sighted and things that seemed deeply counterproductive. There was a huge push to increase US coal consumption in order to reduce oil consumption at that time. But a lot of the things that the Carter administration wound up rummaging through the policy drawers to find probably could have been found in 1965, I think, if the administration of the day had been having a go. So I don't want to, rain too hard on the parade, because it's like this is a far-sighted report, and the US was going from they were in a real mess environmentally around this time, and rivers catching on fire and all kinds of ghastly things happening. So they had a lot of other problems to focus on, but they did need a couple of paisley tie wearing or mini skirt beclad young policy wonks.
Thank you.
To get in there and say to these scientists, yeah, but we've got to do something.
Yeah.
We can't just have more scientists, good as they are.
Yeah. So if I guess if I was tagging along with you, Jennifer and Leo, in that meeting as the intern or whatever, I would have been advising you to say all of that and also put it in the context of some of the other, hugely complex, scary challenges that are being faced by America and the world at that time. This is at the height of the Cold War, conflict between the USSR and the US, which has resulted in the space race, which is, throwing off all kinds of interesting technological innovation as a byproduct, as you've indicated, Tennant. it's not an era in which big, thorny, kind of almost overwhelming problems, people aren't trying to get their arms around them. They are.
Yep.
And I think what one could say is this might be the next cab off the rank. We're not 100% sure, but it's looking pretty bad. And the earlier we start work on it, the better chance we will have, Mr. President, of heading it off at the pass. And I think that if there was one, and I know there's recommendations for further research, I think what I would be saying is let's set up a little team to focus on this within the administration, and maybe don't just leave it to a couple of scientists in the Bureau of Meteorology to kind of keep, plugging away at their model.
Yes.
Let's elevate this and have them report back to you, every 6 months or so, something on how things are progressing, and also some of the practical things we could do to respond. I think that would be best case, right?
Yep.
5-person team in the administration. This is all they're thinking about, and we'll come back to you. We'll keep you informed. And it's an interesting thought experiment because there are all these sliding doors moments, right?
Yeah.
And while it's a great thing that this got put on the agenda when it did, and the science is really complex and it's drawing on a bunch of different disciplines. One of the things that I really wanted to underline, and I would commend this to our listeners to actually read.
Yep.
There's a lot of the reports that we read, so you don't have to. But this one is a short one. It is in places really beautifully written. The prose is wonderful. It puts the carbon cycle in its full context, and explains in just a few paragraphs in a way that a layperson can understand the importance of carbon dioxide for life, the origin of the carbon in the form of fossil fuels that we rely on for our economy, and what we've unwittingly set in train by relying on fossil fuels to industrialise. It's really compelling in places, but also just could stand up pretty well in any high school textbook on the physical science of climate change. It's good.
Yeah.
Not today. Well, there's a clarity of thinking that was perhaps even more possible at that point, given the science hadn't evolved so much that, scientists like this would have been tempted to really engage and try to explain the vast complexity of this challenge. And instead, they're keeping it pretty simple because that's kind of what they've got at their fingertips. But as you say, it's very compelling and concise. And so I 100% stands up to a reading in 2023.
So is it worth saying one more thing about, although we're not saying one more thing.
Except we are.
Well, maybe we should. Maybe we should all say one more thing about this report.
All right. Well, here's my one more thing, which is that when I went through it, I noticed way up the front there's a dramatis personae. Who are the people on the President's Science Advisory Council and who are the people on all the subcommittees? And the last name on the list of the people in the main council is a guy named Frederick Seitz. And he was, at the time, the president of the National Academy of Sciences, which sounds like the kind of person that you'd put on the President's Science Advisory Council, pretty definitionally. But he became known later on as a leading proponent of climate change denial. He was a co-founder of the George C. Marshall Institute, which promoted a lot of climate science denial and like tobacco health impacts denial, and pushed back on nuclear winter, and generally got itself involved in a lot of, I guess, what we would today call culture war issues from a free markets and anti-communism go together with science denial for some reason perspective. And it just seems particularly galling and bizarre that a guy who was part 25 years later of claiming that all this stuff was made up and newfangled and just a bunch of lefty hippies trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, was in at the ground floor on the establishment of the basic and uncontested by like anybody who's actually knowledgeable in physical science, elements of why CO2 matters. So an interesting yet galling historical footnote.
What about you, Frankie? What's your one more thing?
Well, there was a couple of lines in this report that really stood out to me as maybe the first time it had been explained in a report that, yes, fossil fuels causing the increase in CO2 emissions didn't necessarily translate to just an increase in temperature only. That like the concept of climate change as we know it today means that we are looking at a spectrum of increased severity of different impacts across, seasons and things like that. So there was a couple of lines that talked about like they were explaining that, the volume of CO2 in the atmosphere, like at high latitudes, is half the volume of water vapor, while near the equator it's less than a tenth. But then the result of that, so there's differing concentrations, but then the way that plays out is that the Earth will be affected differently at different seasons, latitudes and heights by changes in the atmospheric CO2 content. So to me, that put the early kind of messaging and warning around the fact that climate change isn't just about warming of the Earth and temperature increases. It's about a fluctuation and so an increased severity and fluctuation that will be felt differently depending on where you are in the world. And I thought that was one of those moments where you're like, aha, this could be the first time this has been articulated in a paper like this. Yeah,
and they need to grapple with it because they acknowledge that on average there was warming worldwide from 1885 to 1940, but there was a slight decrease worldwide between 1940 and 1960 in the mean average temperature. Yep. So they introduced this concept of climactic noise, like carbon dioxide is not the only thing that's acting on the physical system, which is the Earth's climate. There are other things going on, and so one needs to be able to sort of almost extract the impact of the CO2 from all the other things that are going on, which sort of speaks again to the complexity, right?
And in retrospect, a lot of that pause, well, some of that pause may well have been the rapid increase in high atmosphere and stratospheric pollution of industrial emissions of sulfur dioxide and so on.
Yep.
And then the very environmental consciousness of human and animal and plant impacts of all this pollution that started leading economies to pull back on some of that noxious air pollution in the 60s, took a little bit of the break off as the CO2 emissions were rising faster and faster. Or at least that's how it looks to me as an arts law graduate.
I'll take it. What was your one more thing, Lee?
I'm just going to, I flagged it earlier, but I'm just going to point again to the paper that is foreshadowed in this appendix, which is from the US Weather Bureau, a couple of scientists named S. Manabe and Richard Witherald, which were looking at a more sophisticated model for how convection and latent heat transfer and evaporation and condensation of water vapour, how they all kind of interact to influence changes in climatic conditions, as you say, in different geographies, different heights, different times of the year. They say, well, look, this work's taking place. It's going to be important work. We think that it's likely to be a significant contribution to knowledge in this space and likely confirm some of our thinking, but we're waiting for it with bated breath. It did indeed come out a couple of years later. It did provide a bulwark for much of the thinking that is contained in this paper. I have located it. I haven't yet read it, but it's likely to be another sort of interesting exploration of some of the early thinking of the physical sciences of climate change, and we'll include a link to it in the show notes.
Fantastic.
Sounds good. Well, if I was LBJ and these three cats walked in, paisley tied, tie-dyed, skirt-wearing advisors, I would have listened to us. But I would say that, wouldn't I?
Well, I don't know if we should divert any sort of research funding from, substantive research on climate change mitigation. But if there's some extra funding going astray, perhaps we can put it into time travel, and we can be the crack team that travels back.
Yes.
In the DeLorean.
If there was a spare 30 seconds in that presentation, a word or two about the wisdom or not of escalating in Vietnam might have been a good idea too.
Might have had to do that up front though, noting our track record on how long we tend to talk about reports among the three of us. I'm not confident that we could have condensed our messages into a snappy 15-minute preso.
I've got it. All we need to do is load up a iPod with the first 29 episodes of Let Me Sum Up and put it in his top 10 score.
Job done.
But it's true though, right? However compelling and well-reasoned and foresighted one's comments could be, you've got a lot of competition for attention from that administration in that era.
Yes.
Far out. You are on a sticky wicket, even if you are the most compelling advocate in history. Something which is both, quite amorphous, impacts are far away, like, as you say, Tennant, Vietnam, add on to that nuclear war, add on to that race relations in the US, on and on it goes. Geez. Well, that's why I think the little 5-person team is probably, where to pitch it, because it's going to be a rounding error in terms of, the headspace that's going to be taken up in the presidential noggin.
Yeah.
I think that's our show for today.
Indeed.
We're all on social media. We're on Twitter and we're on LinkedIn.
I'm attempting to be on Threads, but I haven't succeeded at the time of recording.
Threads, that's the Facebook /Meta
yes.
intervention in this space. Okay, well, you can report back on
yes.
how that's all going.
Zuckerberg's the good tech billionaire now.
Have they had their cage match yet?
I don't think so.
Right.
I only heard about this the other day and I didn't think it was real.
I found it very confusing.
I Googled it and I was like, oh my God.
Anyway, we're in places, social. It's all a bit fragmented at the moment, but do your best to find us. I'm sure you'll find us somewhere. If you want to be sure to locate us, for us to read the words that you're sending in our direction, you can, of course, send us an email, Frankie.
You certainly can, summer uppers. Chuck an email together, send it on in to mailbag@letmesumup.net and give us your few opinions about. I think we'd like to hear how the rolled gold classic nugget of a 1960s climate paper went down with the audience. So send us your hot takes on this one and anything else you think we should be reading in the next little while, yeah?
Is it an exciting innovation? The Coke Zero of climate podcasts, or is it
the new Coke podcasts? You, listener, shall decide.
What was that green one that came and went very quickly?
The stevia one?
Oh, yeah, it must have been that. Gee, that didn't last very long, did it?
Don't jinx us. Jinx us, Frankie.
No, sorry. We're definitely not the stevia Coke.
All right.
The climate podcast genre.
And if you're not LBJ Tennant, listening to the back catalogue of Let Me Sum Up episodes on a iPod that he apparently has worked out how to charge and operate, where else could one find our back catalogue?
Well, if you have unfettered access to the eardrums of an influential historical figure, get your content from letmesumup.net, where you'll find a great many hours of excellent and occasionally not so excellent reports, always well discussed.
I was wondering where you were going with that. Sometimes meandering.
Sometimes.
But always getting there in the end.
All right. Well, for Frankie Paskovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll meander with you again soon.
Segregation, determination, demonstration, integration, aggravation, humiliation, obligation to our nation, ball of confusion. That's what the world is today. Sang, who was it? Oh my God, it was the Temptations.
Oh, yeah.
Just like 3 years later. They didn't have climate change in their lyrics. I blame the Temptations.
But it would have been cool if they'd been in the room with the backing music for the prezzo.
That's true. Yes.